Well, I'm joined now from London by Ben Southwood, who's Head of Policy at the Adam Smith Institute, and also by Tony Yates, who's the Reader of Economics at Bristol University and who previously worked at the Bank of England in its Monetary Analysis Directorate. Thank you both very much for joining us. Tony Yates, let me ask you first. Are we overly fixated on deficit reduction and getting the national debt down?
I think we are a little bit. I mean, for me, none of the main parties seem to get it. That fine, we do have to manage public finances, but right now, monetary policy is maxed out, and strict deficit reduction is going to contract the economy, weaken demand, and weaken inflation. And the Bank of England's already struggling to meet its inflation target. So I think deficit reduction right now is hazardous, actually, economically hazardous. And this is coming from someone, I've been writing before, but I was actually supportive of the coalition's initial plans, because at that time inflation was well above target and there was a risk of another financial crisis, and there was a lot to worry about. We're in a completely different situation now, so I think deficit reduction is for later and definitely not now.
Ben Southwood, it's not just Tony Yates who thinks that. The Nobel Prize-winning economist Paul Krugman has been writing that he thinks, unfortunately, economic discourse in Britain is dominated by a misleading fixation on budget deficits. Do you agree with him?
Well, surprisingly, I agree with a lot of what Tony and Paul Krugman says. Paul Krugman's especially right about it doesn't seem like the markets thought that there was going to be a debt crisis in the UK. So the reason we needed to reduce the deficit might not have been because we thought we were going to have a Greek-like situation. In fact, the markets thought we were always going to be able to pay back our debt, and they're always willing to lend us money at fairly low interest rates. But there are some reasons to worry about deficits in general. Firstly, deficits take money out of the economy which could be used for investment. That's not true in certain situations, but I'd say now, when we have a strongly growing economy, that is true. Secondly, when the government borrows money, eventually it has to pay it back. When it pays it back, it has to levy taxes to pay it back. Levying taxes is widely agreed to reduce economic activity, which makes us poorer in general.
Yes, Tony Yates, I mean, it is true that what we pay back on debt interest at the moment is more than we spend on defence, so that is something to worry about, isn't it?
Sure, the numbers can sound frightening, but there's another risk to weigh on the other side. If we were to start reducing the deficit sharply now, we'd be at risk of ending up like Japan, with interest rates permanently trapped at their natural floor of zero, the economy growing sluggishly with no room for manoeuvre with either fiscal or monetary policy to stabilise the economy. We don't want that to happen. For me, that's the bigger risk. I appreciate some of the things that Ben's worrying about, but it's weighing up one risk against the other.
Ben Southwood, it was interesting last week, Christine Lagarde, the head of the International Monetary Fund, was praising what had happened in the UK, saying it's obvious what's happened in Britain has actually worked. And she was taken to be referring to austerity, but of course we have kind of had austerity light in the last few years. The Chancellor hasn't cut spending as much as he said he was going to. So what is it that's worked? Has it been the austerity, or has it been the easing off of austerity?
So I'd say it's neither. I'd say that there's been too much focus on the government's fiscal policy over big movements in the international economy. So I'd say that the big thing which is helping us at the moment is lots of costs have gone down, like oil prices, and they impact on loads of things, and that makes us able to produce more at the same price. So that's why we're getting very fast growth, but at the same time we're getting 0% inflation. This is basically, just as much of the problems in 2012 and 2013 were internationally driven, now much of the success now is internationally driven. We can focus too much on fiscal policy, and I'd say that now is another case of that.
So it's interesting, I mean, both of you agreeing that possibly the debt and the deficit aren't as important as politicians would have us believe. Why, Tony Yates, do you think it is that the politicians seem to be in a competition, a race to beat each other to when they can get the deficit eliminated?
Well, I think there's an element of truth in what they're worrying about. In that, in the very long term, you do need to make sure that the national debt is not too high. Mainly so that if a generation is unlucky enough to live through another economic crisis, you can run it back up again and turn the fiscal taps on, and pay unemployment, disability, incapacity, all those benefits that take up so much money. So you need to control the debt so you can let it rise again in those bad times. That's the kernel of truth in what they're worrying about. But I think part of it is just a fixation on trying to outdo each other, to look the most prudent, the most economically competent, and that translates into in very simplistic terms into sort of household debt management language, which often isn't appropriate, especially not now.
So Ben Southwood, would even the Adam Smith Institute tell us that we don't need cuts quite as drastic as the Tories are proposing?
I generally agree with the programme they've put out. The real issue is that there doesn't seem to be a clear way they can actually achieve this programme, and it's probably likely they won't end up doing what they have said they'll do.
And they say, of course, it would be dangerous to take longer to eliminate the deficit. The Labour Party are talking about an extra couple of years before they would be rid of the deficit. The SNP, another 2 or 3 years after that. Does that really pose the dangers that the Tories warn us about?
So they might be wrong about the specific dangers in that they're probably wrong that there'll be a debt crisis if they slow down austerity. But I still think that austerity in general is a good idea for the reasons I said earlier. We can get more private investment, and that means lower taxes down the line, which means more economic activity if we do more austerity.
Tony Yates, more austerity will equal more economic growth, or do you think it will actually hamper economic growth?
Well, you know, it's an interesting argument. I like what Ben writes and what that institute writes. It's sort of nice and clean, and it makes you think, but it just doesn't stand up to any empirical or scrutiny, really. For example, there's a recent survey of academic economists, and I think 68% of them disagreed with that statement. They all thought that austerity had reduced economic activity during the lifetime of the coalition. So I don't think anyone really immersed in this really believes that.
All right. Well, Ben Southwood, Tony Yates, thank you both very much for talking to us tonight.
No problem.